Okay, so let's consider what some of the differences are between the aggregate demand curve and, say, a demand curve for an individual product, such as apples. Now, the first thing we want to realize is that the aggregate demand curve shows the relationship between the price level and quantity of real GDP demanded by households, firms, and government. So essentially, it's a very macro level looking graph. On the other hand, the demand curve for apples just narrows that down to the price of apples and the quantity demanded of apples on the axes. The second difference between the two curves is to do with the fact that they're both downward sloping. And they're both downward sloping, but for different reasons. Now, the aggregate demand curve is downward sloping due to three things: the wealth effect, the interest rate effect, and the international trade effect. And let's go over all of these quickly. And the way to kind of frame this is first to realize that if you were to have a fall in price levels, then what would happen to each of these components? Where Y over here is essentially the real GDP, and it's a component of consumption, investment, government expenditures, and net exports. And here we're considering that government expenditures and transfers aren't due to changes in price level, and they're done independently. So let's look at all the other three remaining items individually. So if prices fall, the real value of a household's wealth increases, and so their consumption increases, and that's a C going up. If prices fall, interest rates will also fall in order to encourage spending to prevent deflationary effects, which will also drive up investments and consumption. And finally, lower prices will make domestic exports cheaper and foreign imports more expensive, which eventually drives up net exports too, which also drives up real GDP. So the combined effect of all of these essentially drives up Y, which is real GDP. And so essentially as prices fall, the real GDP will go up, and that's why the aggregate demand curve is downward sloping. The individual demand curve for apples, the reason it's downward sloping is simply that as prices for apples fall, consumers can purchase more of it for a given amount of